It's just dusty old pottery, Arthur. Honestly, it's a fire hazard. If you won't clear this junk out, you'll find someone who will. That was what my daughter-in-law Tiffany told me yesterday. She stood in the doorway of my study, holding her nose as if the scent of 500 years of history was nothing more than the smell of a rotting basement. She didn't see the Ming Dynasty Celadon bowls or the rare Roman coinage to her. It was trash to her. I was just a senile 70-year-old man clinging to relics because I had nothing else left. But as I sat in the back of the courtroom today, watching the color drain from her face, as the federal marshals entered, I realized she had made a fatal mistake. She thought she was selling off a hoarder's collection to pay for her new Tesla. She didn't realize she had just triggered a national asset protection protocol. She didn't know that her quiet little cleanup was actually the theft of national heritage. And she certainly didn't know that the boring old man she ignored at dinner was the only person in the country with the power to sign her arrest warrant. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. To my son, Mark, and his wife, Tiffany, a retired history teacher, living on a meager pension. I played the part well. I wear sweaters with holes in the elbows. I pretend to forget where I put my glasses. And I let them pay for dinner once a month while they complain about their struggles in the middle class. The truth is much heavier. I am a curator emeritus for the National Museum and a senior consultant for the Cultural Property Advisory Committee. I don't just know about antiques. I am the person the government calls when a billionaire tries to smuggle a sarcophagus across the border. I hold a Level 1 state appraiser's license, and my signature is the final word on what constitutes national patrimony. I kept my wealth and my status a secret for a simple reason: I wanted to see who my son had become. And for 3 years, I watched as Tiffany systematically stripped my son of his backbone and replaced it with greed. The tension reached a breaking point last Tuesday. Mark and Tiffany had come over for their weekly check-in, which is really just an excuse for Tiffany to scout the house for things she can sell on eBay. They were under pressure. Mark's fintech startup, which was really just a glorified gambling app, was hemorrhaging cash. They needed a bridge loan, but they had already exhausted their credit. "Dad," Mark said, leaning over the dinner table, his eyes avoiding mine. "We were thinking, this house is too big for you. All this stuff in the West Wing, it's just sitting there." Tiffany found a local estate liquidator who specializes in clearing out, well, clutter. Tiffany chimed in, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern that makes my skin crawl. "We're just worried about your health, Arthur. All that dust. It's bad for your lungs. We could clear it all out, get the house deep cleaned, and maybe, just maybe, there's a few $100s in that old pottery to help cover the costs." I took a slow sip of my tea, looking at her over the rim of the cup. Among that pottery was a Song Dynasty tea bowl I had personally repatriated from a private collection in London 20 years ago. It was worth $3 million on the open market, but because of its historical significance, it was registered as a category a national treasure. Selling it wasn't just a faux pas, it was a felony. "I like my dust, Tiffany," I said quietly. "Every speck of it has a story. I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of the study." Tiffany's smile didn't reach her eyes. She looked at Mark, a sharp, commanding glance that told him he was failing. "Arthur, you're being stubborn. We're family. We only want what's best for you." "Then respect my wishes," I replied. They left shortly after, the air thick with their unspoken resentment. I knew they wouldn't stop. Greed has a way of blinding people to the most obvious warnings. Tiffany looked at my study and saw a shortcut to a luxury lifestyle. She didn't see the security cameras I had installed, not for protection against burglars, but to document the betrayal I knew was coming. 2 days later, I received a notification on my phone. I was at the National Gallery advising on the restoration of a 17th century oil painting. When my home security app pinged, I opened the feed. There was Tiffany, accompanied by two men in fast-track junk removal uniforms. They weren't liquidators, they were muscle. I watched through the hidden lens of a 1920s Leica camera on my shelf. Tiffany was pointing at my shelves with a manic energy. Everything, she told the men. All the jars, the old coins, the books with the leather covers. Throw the broken ones in the truck first. The guy at the antique barn said he'd give me $5,000 for the lot, sight unseen, just to use them as shabby, chic decor. $5,000. For a collection with an aggregate insurance valuation of $42 million. But it wasn't the money that made my blood run cold. It was the way she handled a Colombian gold figurine. She tossed it into a cardboard box, like it was a plastic Happy Meal toy. I heard the faint clink of gold against ceramic, the sound of history being bruised by ignorance. I could have called the police right then. I could have called Mark and told him to stop his wife. But if I did that, they would just wait for the next opportunity. They would play the victim. They would say I was confused and that they were helping. No, if I was going to protect these pieces, I had to let her commit the act. I had to let her move the assets. In the world of high-stakes cultural litigation, the crime isn't thinking about stealing. It's the illegal transfer of title and the violation of the National Heritage Act. I sat in my office at the museum, my hands steady, and watched as they loaded the last of my life's work into a rusted-out box truck. Tiffany stood on my porch, checking her watch, looking triumphant. She thought she had finally won. She thought she had cleared out the trash. She didn't know that I was already typing an email to the Department of Justice's Art Crime Team. The subject line was simple unauthorized deaccession and trafficking of registered national treasures, case file 882. Alpha. I didn't head home instead. I drove to my lawyer's office. It was time to stop being the senile grandfather and start being the principal witness. Arthur, my lawyer, Marcus said, as I walked in. He's a man who specializes in international repatriation law. He knew exactly what was in that house. I saw the alert. Tell me she didn't. She did, I said, sitting down and smoothing out my cardigan. She sold the entire West Wing collection to a third-party reseller for $5,000. No bill of sale, no provenance checks, no tax declarations. Marcus leaned back, a grim smile on his face. She just committed grand larceny, wire fraud, and, considering the Song Dynasty pieces are on the Federal Registry, she's looking at violation of the 1979 Archaeological Resources Protection Act. I don't want a settlement, Marcus, I said, my voice cold and precise. I want a full prosecution. I want her to understand the weight of what she called trash. And your son? Marcus asked. I looked out the window. Mark had a choice to protect his father's legacy. He chose to look the other way. He's an accessory. After the fact, the moment he touches a cent of that money. I spent the next 4 hours preparing the expert affidavit. Every piece Tiffany had taken was documented in my private ledger. I had the carbon-14 dating results, the spectrographic analysis, and the original deeds of gift from the Ministry of Culture. By the time I was done, Tiffany wasn't just a daughter-in-law who had overstepped in the eyes of the law. She was an international art trafficker. I drove home late that evening. The house was unnervingly quiet. The study, which had been filled with the whispers of ancient civilizations, was gutted. Empty shelves stared back at me like vacant eye sockets. My phone rang. It was Mark. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice forced and cheerful. "Listen, Tiffany and I stopped by today. We noticed you were out, so we decided to do you a huge favor. We cleared out all that old junk in the study. You wouldn't believe how much space you have now. We even managed to get a little recycling fee for it. I'll drop off a check for $200 tomorrow." I looked at the empty spot where a 14th century Venetian glass vase had sat this morning. "You sold it all, Mark?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "Sold is a strong word, Dad. We liquidated it. It's for the best. Really. Now you don't have to worry about cleaning it anymore. Anyway, Tiffany's taking me out to a celebratory dinner. Well, see you tomorrow, okay? Yes, I said softly. I'll see you tomorrow. I hung up. I didn't tell him that the junk he had liquidated was currently being tracked by a special task force. I didn't tell him that the recycling fee was about to cost them their freedom. I sat in my armchair in the middle of the empty room, the moonlight casting long shadows on the floorboards. I looked like a defeated old man, but in my hand, I held a phone that was currently receiving a location ping from the GPS transponder hidden inside the false bottom of the Ming Dynasty bowl. Tiffany had taken the collection to a warehouse in the industrial district. She was meeting the buyer at midnight. She wanted the cash fast. Before I realized what was missing, she was about to find out that when you steal from a museum expert, you aren't just stealing an object. You're stealing from the state, and the state has a very long memory. The GPS signal on my laptop pulsed like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. A small red dot was stationary in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city Unit 42, a self-storage facility known more for its lack of oversight than its security. I wasn't alone in my study anymore. Two men in dark suits, special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Art Crime Team, sat at my kitchen table. Between them lay a digital tablet displaying the same tracking data. "He's there, Arthur," Agent Miller said, his voice low. "Your buyer is a man named Silas Thorne. He runs a network of front companies that specialize in cleaning stolen assets. Usually, it's jewelry or high-end electronics. He's out of his depth with Ming Dynasty Celadon." "That's the point, Agent," I replied, my eyes fixed on the screen. "He thinks he's buying high-end decor from a disgruntled housewife. He hasn't performed any due diligence. No provenance search, no international art loss register check. By the time he realizes what he has, the chain of custody will be firmly established." "And your daughter, in law?" Miller asked. "She's currently at a high-end steakhouse with my son," I said, checking the timestamp on a credit card alert I had set up on our joint family account. "She just spent $400 on a bottle of Cabernet. She's celebrating the recycling fee she earned from my life's work." I felt a pang of something, not regret, but a cold, clinical disappointment. I had given Mark every opportunity to be a man of integrity. I had taught him about the value of history, the importance of stewardship, but he had allowed Tiffany to turn his father's legacy into a disposable commodity. In the eyes of the law, Tiffany was the primary actor, but Mark's failure to report the removal of registered assets made him a culpable party under the National Heritage Protection Act. "We move at dawn?" Miller asked. "No," I said, a thin smile touching my lips. "We wait. I want her to try and move the money. I want her to believe she's gotten away with it. Let her experience the high of the theft. The fall is much more instructive that way." The next morning, the minor failures began. Tiffany arrived at my house around 10 a.m. She was wearing a new pair of designer sunglasses and carrying a latte that probably cost more than my daily grocery budget. She walked into my gutted study, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors, where the 18th century Persian rugs used to lie. "Morning, Arthur," she chirped. She didn't look at the empty shelves. She didn't look at me. She went straight to the kitchen. "Mark told you about the cleanup, right? Don't you just love how much breathable the house feels now?" "It's very spacious, Tiffany," I said, sitting in my usual chair. I was holding a folder, but to her it just looked like a stack of old bills. "Did the liquidator give you a receipt for the items?" Tiffany froze for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the sugar bowl. She laughed a sharp, brittle sound. "Oh, Arthur, it's a junk removal service. They don't do receipts. It's all cash under the table. That's how you get the best deal. You know, I see. And the amount?" "Mark mentioned a few $100s. 500, she lied, her voice smooth. I knew for a fact. Silas Thorne had handed her 5,000 in cash and a wire transfer for another 20, a pittance for the collection, but a fortune to her. "I'll give your half once the processing fees are cleared. But honestly, Arthur, I'd just spend it on more old dusty things." Why don't I just keep it in a savings fund for your future care? She was already trying to embezzle the pittance she'd made from the crime. That's very thoughtful of you, I said. She checked her phone, her brow furrowing. Ugh, this bank is so annoying. I tried to deposit a small gift from a friend this morning, and they put a 72-hour administrative hold on it. Something about large currency transaction reports. Honestly, the government is so nosy. I took a sip of my tea. She didn't realize that I was the one who had triggered that hold. As a senior consultant for the Treasury, I had the authority to flag accounts suspected of antiquities trafficking. The moment that $20,000 wire hit her account from a known shell company in the Cayman Islands, the FinCEN Financial Crimes Enforcement Network alarms had started screaming. It's probably just a formality, I said mildly. They take unusual activity very seriously these days. It's a headache is what it is, she snapped. Anyway, I have a lunch date with the girls. Mark will be by later to help you move some of your remaining clothes. We've been looking at some lovely assisted living communities, very modern, no room for old pottery. There, thank God. She patted my hand condescendingly and swept out of the house. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway. Then I picked up the phone. Agent Miller, it's Arthur. She has officially attempted to integrate the proceeds of the sale into the banking system. We have money laundering to add to the grand larceny. Proceed with the secondary surveillance on the storage unit. And Miller? Yes, Arthur? Make sure the antique barn owner knows that if he tries to move that Song Dynasty bowl before the sun sets, he'll be facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years. I want the collection intact for the reveal. The rest of the day was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mark called me at noon, sounding panicked. Dad, did you call the insurance company? I just got a notification that the policy on the house items has been suspended pending investigation. Oh, I didn't call them, Mark, I said, playing the role of the confused retiree perfectly. But I did mention to the agent last week that I was worried about the junk in the West Wing. Maybe they're just doing an audit? An audit? Now, Tiffany already cleared the stuff out. If they find out the items are gone before we officially updated the manifest, they might claim insurance fraud. Well, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and steady. That would be a problem, wouldn't it? Since the items are gone and you don't have a bill of sale or an appraisal report for the disposal. Dad, you're not helping, Mark groaned. I have to call Tiffany's, trying to buy a new SUV with her savings. If the bank hold and the insurance audit hit at the same time, we're going to look like we're broke. But you are broke, Mark, I reminded him. Your startup is insolvent. Your credit is maxed. This cleanup was your Hail Mary, wasn't it? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Mark's ragged breathing for a second. I thought he might confess. I thought he might say, Dad, I'm sorry, we're in over our heads. Well, get the stuff back. Instead, he said, we're doing this for you, Dad, to keep you in a good home. Just stay out of it. Let Tiffany handle the business. I understand, I said, I'll stay out of it. For now, I hung up and looked at the clock. 4 p.m. in 2 hours. Tiffany and Mark were hosting a success party at their rented condo. They had invited their socialite friends, bragged about their newfound liquidity, and were planning to announce their move to a more prestigious zip code. They thought they were at the finish line. They didn't know that the storage unit had already been raided. They didn't know that Silas Thorne was currently in a windowless room, singing like a bird to the FBI, and they certainly didn't know that the senile old man was currently trading his moth-eaten sweater for a bespoke charcoal suit and a State Department ED badge. I walked to the empty study one last time. I picked up a small, overlooked fragment of Roman glass, a tiny piece of cobalt blue that Tiffany had missed, because it was just a shard. I tucked it into my breast pocket. History, I whispered to the empty room, has a way of repeating itself, especially for those who refuse to learn from it. I walked out to my car, not the beat-up sedan they thought I drove, but the black executive SUV that had been waiting for me around the corner. "Where to, Mr. Penhaligon?" the driver asked. "The gala," I said. "I believe it's time to show my daughter-in-law the true value of her trash." The penthouse was exactly what I expected: glass walls, minimalist furniture that cost more than it was worth, and a crowd of people whose smiles were as curated as their Instagram feeds. Tiffany was in her element. She was wearing a dress that probably cost $3,000, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne and laughing at a joke made by a man I recognized as a local real estate shark. Mark stood beside her, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was a size too small. He looked like a man who was trying very hard to believe his own lies. I stood at the entrance for a moment, the weight of the Federal Commission credentials in my inner pocket. The doorman had tried to stop me, seeing only the elderly man in the charcoal suit. But one look at the gold, embossed senior consultant badge had silenced him. I walked into the center of the room. The music, some generic pulsing lounge track, seemed to dim as I approached. "Arthur?" Tiffany's voice was a mixture of shock and irritation. She set her glass down on a marble table. "What are you doing here? And why are you dressed like that? Did you wander away from your senile act?" A few of the guests snickered. Mark stepped forward, his face flushing. "Dad, this isn't a good time. We're in the middle of an important announcement." "I know, Mark," I said, my voice projecting with a resonance that stopped the room. "You're announcing your liquidity. You're announcing your departure from the clutter of the past. It's a shame, really. You should have checked the National Cultural Heritage Registry before you decided to liquidate my life." Tiffany stepped toward me, her eyes flashing. "Arthur, don't do this. Don't make a scene. You're embarrassed because we cleaned out your junk. Get over it. It's gone. Sold. You have no claim to it anymore." "On the contrary, Tiffany," I said, pulling a leather-bound folder from under my arm. "I have every claim. And more importantly, the United States government has a claim." I opened the folder and pulled out a high-resolution photograph. It was the Song Dynasty tea bowl. "Do you recognize this, Tiffany? You sold it to Silas Thorne for a portion of $25,000. You called it junk. You handled it without gloves. You threw it into a cardboard box." Tiffany scoffed, looking at her friends for support. "It's a bowl, Arthur, an old dusty bowl. I got $5,000 in cash and a wire for the rest. That's more than it's worth as a cereal dish." "That bowl," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper, "is a registered national treasure. It was repatriated under the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. It is currently valued by the Sotheby's Institute at approximately $2 million." The room went silent. The real estate shark's jaw dropped. Mark looked like he was about to faint. "4 million?" Tiffany stammered, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. Then she tried to pivot. "Well, then you should be thanking me. Well, get a better price." "We can. You won't get anything, Tiffany," I interrupted, "because the moment you sold that item without a certificate of non-export and failed to declare the transfer of a category asset, you triggered a Section 12 administrative search warrant. You didn't sell a bowl. You trafficked in national heritage." I signaled toward the door. Agent Miller and 3 other men in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back entered the penthouse. The music stopped abruptly. The guests began to shrink back toward the walls. "Tiffany Penhaligon? Mark Penhaligon?" Agent Miller stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and violations of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act." "This is a mistake," Tiffany screamed, her voice cracking. "It was he's my father-in-law. He gave it to us." "I gave you nothing," I said, stepping closer to her. "I told you to stay out of my study. I told you that every piece had a story. You chose not to listen because you were too busy calculating the resale value of things you couldn't possibly understand." "Dad, please!" Mark cried out as an agent grabbed his arms. I didn't know! I didn't know it was worth that much. I just wanted to save the business. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Mark, I said, looking him in the eye. But ignorance of your father's life? That's a choice. You spent 30 years looking at me and seeing a retired teacher. You never once asked why the director of the Louvre sends me Christmas cards. You never once asked why I have a direct line to the State Department. I turned back to Tiffany. She was struggling, her designer heels scraping against the floor as Miller led her toward the door. The wire transfer from the Cayman Islands? I said. That was flagged 4 hours ago. The cash you took from Silas Thorne? It was marked. And the storage unit? Every single piece has been recovered and is currently being processed by the National Museum's forensic unit. You've earned yourself a tax clawback that will strip this penthouse bare, Tiffany. Every cent you've spent in the last 48 hours will be recovered under asset forfeiture. You did this, she shrieked, her face contorted with rage. You set us up! You're a monster! No, I said quietly. I am a curator. My job is to protect things of value from people who would destroy them. Today, that included my own family. The room was a blur of motion. The guests were fleeing. The success party had turned into a crime scene. I watched as my son and his wife were led out in shame, their dreams of a luxury lifestyle evaporating in the cold light of the hallway. The penthouse was empty now, save for me and Agent Miller. The sunset was painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold, reflecting off the floor, two ceiling windows. We have the collection, Arthur, Miller said, handing me a digital manifest. Everything is intact. The songbowl has a minor scratch on the base, nothing the restorers can't handle, but it's safe. They're being transported to the National Vault tonight. Thank you. Miller, I said. He'll be there in the morning to oversee the cataloging. And your son? Miller asked, his voice softening. The prosecutor is looking at a plea deal if he testifies against Thorne. He might avoid the heavy time, but his reputation is finished. Mark will have to learn to live with the consequences of his silence, I said. He watched her take those pieces. He watched her treat history like trash. He has to decide what kind of man he is when he doesn't have his father's clutter to sell. I walked over to the marble table and picked up the crystal flute Tiffany had left behind. I poured the champagne into a nearby sink. They always think power is about what you can buy, I whispered. They never realize it's about what you can preserve. I left the penthouse and took the elevator down to the street. My driver was waiting. As we drove through the city, I looked out at the lights. People think that being an expert means knowing dates and names, but being an expert is about understanding the soul of an object. That song bowl survived floods, wars, and the rise and fall of empires. It survived 500 years of human greed, only to be tossed in a box by a woman who wanted a faster car. History is patient. It waits for the pretenders to fade away. I returned to my house. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean. The empty shelves in my study didn't look like eye sockets anymore. They looked like a fresh canvas. I sat in my armchair and pulled the small shard of Roman glass from my pocket. I held it up to the moonlight. It was just a fragment, broken, discarded, and worthless to anyone who didn't know how to look. But to me, it was a reminder. You can take the artifacts. You can sell the gold. You can even try to sell the man, but you can never steal the truth. I closed my eyes, the cool glass pressed against my palm. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of rebuilding. I would find new pieces, tell new stories, and continue my watch, because I am the secret expert. And in a world that knows the price of everything and the value of nothing, I am the only one who truly knows the difference.